The gown was gone by the time Lady Cordelia Wren came down to dress for her own wedding. Not misplaced, not lost, sold, 3 days earlier, to a merchant's wife in Cheapside who had paid, by the housekeeper's quiet reckoning, less than a third of what the silk alone had cost. Cordelia stood in the doorway of her own bedchamber on the morning of her 19th year, in her shift, staring at an empty dress form where 40 yards of ivory silk and her late mother's Brussels lace had hung the night before, and understood with a kind of icy, arriving calm that her stepmother had not made a mistake. She had made a decision. "You'll wear the blue," said Lady Priscilla Wren from the doorway, not quite meeting her eyes. "It's perfectly serviceable." Serviceable? As though a wedding gown were a pair of gloves. As though the man waiting for her at St. George's, a duke no less, a man half of London had spent the season trying to catch for their own daughters, would simply overlook the fact that his bride had arrived looking as though she'd borrowed a dress from her own maid. Cordelia said nothing. She had learned, in the years since her father's remarriage and then his death, that arguing only sharpened the knife. What she did not yet understand, standing in that ruined room with her hands very still at her sides, was that the dress had not been sold for money at all. Priscilla had barely troubled to hide how little the sale had brought her. She had sold it for what it would do to Cordelia, in front of 300 witnesses. It had not always been this way between them, though Cordelia sometimes had to work to remember that. Her mother, Eleanor Wren, had died within days of Cordelia's birth in the autumn of 1798. Of a childbed fever the physicians of the time had no answer for, and so Cordelia had grown up with no memory of her at all, only a miniature portrait, a scent of orange water that lingered faintly on an old shawl no one had thought to launder, and a father who spoke of his first wife so rarely that Cordelia had, for most of her childhood, assumed the subject was simply forbidden rather than unbearable. Lord Wren had remained a widower for 11 years, raising his daughter with a distracted, well-meaning affection, before he married Priscilla Fenwick in the spring of 1809, when Cordelia was 11 years old. For a time, not long but real, Priscilla had made an effort. There had been a summer of riding lessons, an autumn of shared novels read aloud by the fire. It was only after Lord Wren's death, 4 years later, in 1813, when Cordelia was 15 and the whole of her guardianship passed to Priscilla alone, unsupervised by any man's oversight, that the effort had curdled into something else entirely, a long, careful accounting in which every kindness shown to Cordelia seemed to be weighed against some private ledger only Priscilla could read. Cordelia had been in Priscilla's soul-keeping 4 years now. It felt, some mornings, like considerably longer. Across London, in a townhouse considerably colder than the weather outside it, the Duke of Ravensmere was already regretting the entire arrangement, though not for any reason his mother would have guessed. He was 31, a man the Ton had long ago decided was married to his ledgers, and his silence in equal measure. He had inherited the dukedom at 11 years past, upon his father's sudden death, and had spent the decade since converting a startled young man's grief into the particular flat competence that London mistook for coldness because it had never once seen what lay beneath it. He had chosen Cordelia Wren for reasons he had not troubled to explain to anyone, least of all himself. It was not her fortune. So far as anyone in London knew, she had none worth mentioning. It was not her connections. Her stepmother had seen to it, whether by design or simple neglect, that what little standing the Wrens once held had quietly eroded over 4 years of half-attended invitations and unanswered calls. He had met Cordelia properly only twice, before offering for her. Once at a musical evening where she had spent the whole of the interval listening rather than performing for an audience, and once in a crowded garden where, finding herself briefly alone with him while their respective parties argued cheerfully over a game of Pall Mall, she had asked him a question about his Hampshire tenant's drainage rather than his title, and had listened to the answer as though it actually interested her. Both times he had come away with the unsettling impression that she was the only person in any room who had never once asked him for anything. He did not yet know that the woman he was to marry within the hour had spent the last 3 days concealing a humiliation so precise it could only have been designed by someone who knew exactly where she was most easily wounded. He did not yet know that his own mother, The Dowager Duchess Augusta, had called at the Wren townhouse 2 days prior and left a letter Cordelia had never been permitted to read. And he did not yet know, would not know for some hours yet, that a document case now travelling towards St. George's under a Chancery solicitor's careful custody, sealed 19 years earlier and set aside against exactly this morning, was about to make Priscilla's small, vicious cruelty look like the very least of anyone's problems. At 10:30, Cordelia descended the stairs of her stepmother's house in a blue morning gown fit for calling on neighbours, not for standing before a duke, and found the carriage already waiting. Priscilla did not offer an arm. She did not offer a word of comfort. She only watched her stepdaughter go, with an expression Cordelia had seen many times before and had never once been able to name, until this morning, when it finally resolved itself into something closer to satisfaction than she had ever let herself believe. What Cordelia could not have known, climbing into that carriage in a gown that was not hers to wear on the only day it would ever matter, was that the Duke waiting for her at the altar had already decided, whatever the state of her dress, that he would not let the ceremony proceed exactly as planned, though what he intended to do instead was a secret he had shared with exactly one person that morning, and that person was not his bride. St. George's, Hanover Square, was already full by the time Cordelia's carriage drew up outside it. 300 candles, 300 faces, and not one of them, she thought grimly, would remember a single word of the ceremony. They would remember the blue dress. They would talk of nothing else for a fortnight, and Priscilla, seated somewhere among them in amethyst silk, that had certainly not been purchased for a third of its worth, would hear every word of it repeated back to her with satisfaction for a season. She walked the aisle on the arm of her uncle, a mild, ineffectual man who had never once in 4 years found the courage to contradict his sister-in-law, and she kept her chin exactly level, because level was the only thing left entirely within her control. She did not look at the whispers rippling through the pews, like wind through wheat. She did not look for Priscilla's face. She looked only at the man waiting for her at the altar, tall and composed in dark blue superfine, his expression giving away nothing at all, which was, she had come to understand in 3 months of careful acquaintance, precisely what his expression was for. He watched her come toward him in a gown meant for calling cards, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not read, and would spend the rest of that day trying to name. The vicar had barely opened his prayer book when the doors of St. George's opened a second time. It was not a fashionable lateness. It was not a forgotten guest slipping in at the back. The doors were thrown open with the particular unhurried authority of a woman who has never once in her life needed to knock, and the entire church turned as one to watch the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere come up the aisle beside a solicitor in sober black, carrying between them a document case of considerable age, its clasp still bearing an old private seal that had not been broken in 19 years. Cordelia felt the Duke's hand find hers before she understood why she needed it. "Forgive the interruption," the Dowager said, and her voice, pitched to carry, silenced 300 whispering guests as thoroughly as a struck bell. "But I find I cannot in good conscience allow this marriage to proceed one moment further without certain matters being made plain, to the bride most of all." Priscilla Wren, 3 rows back, had gone the color of old wax. Cordelia would remember, afterward, that she had noticed her stepmother's stillness before she noticed anything else, a stillness with no satisfaction left in it at all, which was, of every strange thing that happened that morning, the detail that frightened her most. "Your Grace," the vicar began, uncertain whether he was meant to continue or step aside, and the Dowager answered him with a single look that settled the question entirely. "I knew your mother," she said, turning to Cordelia, and something in the older woman's composure cracked, just slightly, around the edges of that sentence. "Eleanor Wren was the dearest friend I had in this world before she was ever your mother. And when the fever took her, not a week after you were born, she asked one thing of me, that I see to it you were never entirely without protection, whatever became of your father's second marriage. I have spent 19 years trying to keep that promise from a careful distance, because she asked it in confidence, and it is only released from that confidence now, by the terms she set down herself." She lifted the case. This was lodged in chancery upon your mother's death, a trust and a letter, to be delivered to you upon your marriage or your 25th birthday, whichever came the sooner. I have known its contents for 19 years and told no one, not even my own son, because that was the promise I made her. I break my silence now only because I learned, within the last 3 days, that someone in this church has been working a great deal harder than I have to see that this morning never arrived at all. The words landed on Cordelia like cold water. Beside her she felt the Duke go very still, and understood, with a small shock that arrived alongside everything else, that whatever was happening, he had not known it was coming either. "What is she talking about?" Cordelia said, very quietly, to the man she had been about to marry. "I don't know," he said, and she believed him, because his voice carried none of the careful composure she had grown used to. It carried, instead, something close to alarm. The vicar, sensibly, closed his prayer book. What followed did not happen at the altar. It could not, decency and 300 guests being what they were, and so the wedding party removed itself. Bride, groom, dowager, solicitor, and, drawn along by a summons she could not refuse without confirming every suspicion in the room, Priscilla Wren, into the vestry, where the Dowager Duchess broke the old seal with hands that were, Cordelia noticed, not entirely steady. Inside was a letter in a hand Cordelia had never seen and recognized instantly all the same, because grief has its own peculiar way of making a stranger's handwriting feel like an inheritance. "My dearest girl," it began, "if you are reading this, I have been gone the whole of your life, and I am sorry for every year of it." The letter was not long. It did not need to be. Eleanor Wren, dying within days of her daughter's birth, had used her last strength to secure 2 things through Augusta, then a new duchess herself, and Eleanor's closest confidant. A trust of £11,000, settled through the Court of Chancery rather than through her husband's estate, specifically so that it could not be touched, mismanaged, or absorbed into any future marriage he might make, and a standing place at court in Cordelia's own right, a personal courtesy owed to Eleanor's years of quiet service in the household of Queen Charlotte, to be claimed the moment Cordelia came into her trust, independent of whatever family circumstance she found herself in by then. "I do not know who you will have become," the letter closed. "I know only that I wanted you to have one thing in this world that no one else could sell, spend, or give away on your behalf. Forgive me for not trusting your father to keep it safe, whoever he chose to share his house with after me. I did not know, writing this with a week-old daughter I would never see grow, how right I would turn out to be." Cordelia read it twice before she understood that the second silence in the room, the one beneath the dowager's careful explanation, belonged entirely to Priscilla. "You knew," Cordelia said, lifting her eyes at last from the page. "Some part of this you have always known." Priscilla did not deny it. That, more than anything, was what told Cordelia the whole of it had been building for years. Not months, not since the engagement was announced, but for the entire 8 years since she had first come into this family, going all the way back to a summer of riding lessons that had quietly, imperceptibly stopped. "Your father told me before he died," Priscilla said, and for the first time in 4 years her voice had no command left in it at all. "He told me there was money set aside somewhere I could not touch, tied up with lawyers and old promises to a dead woman, and that it would come to you the day you married, whoever you married, and that until then it was mine to guard as I saw fit." Her mouth twisted. Guard. As though 8 years of her keep and clothing and every dressmaker's bill I settled from my own purse. And 4 of those years alone, with no husband's income behind me at all, were nothing at all against a fortune sitting untouched in chancery, waiting for the day some man took her off my hands and left me with nothing to show for any of it. "So you sold the dress," the Duke said. His voice had gone very quiet and very cold, and Cordelia realized she had not yet heard him truly angry until this moment. "You could not touch the trust. You could not stop the marriage outright, without questions being asked of you directly." So you did the one thing you could still control on the morning it mattered most. You humiliated her in front of every witness who might otherwise have believed the marriage a triumph, in the hope that shame alone would make her call it off. Or make me call it off for her. I did not think a duke would marry a girl who couldn't even manage her own wedding gown, Priscilla said. And there was, beneath the venom, something almost pitiful in it. The sound of a woman only now hearing how her own careful logic sounded, said aloud in front of witnesses. I thought you would see her arrive in that dress and understand at last what sort of household you were marrying into. I did not think... She stopped. You did not think I would still want her, the Duke finished. And it was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. You built an entire scheme on the assumption that the only thing anyone could ever love in her was how she looked on a single morning. You have spent 8 years underestimating a woman you helped raise, madam, and I confess I find that the least forgivable failure in this whole affair. Cordelia had gone very still through all of it, the letter loose in her hands, and it was the Dowager Duchess who finally turned to her and asked, gently, the question no one else had thought to. What would you like to do, child? The marriage need not proceed today, if you would rather it did not. You are, as of this hour, a woman of considerable independent means, with a standing invitation to court that owes nothing to any man's name. You are not obliged to marry anyone, least of all in haste, on a morning like this one. It was, Cordelia understood slowly, the first time in her adult life anyone had asked her what she wanted, rather than telling her what she would surrender. She looked at the Duke, and found him watching her with an expression she had never once seen him wear in 3 months of correct, careful courtship. Something unguarded, and faintly afraid, as though he had only just understood he might lose her in the very room where he had expected to marry her. Did you know, she asked him, any part of this? The trust? The letter? Any of it? Before this morning? No, he said. And then, because he was not a man who had ever learned to soften a hard truth for his own comfort, he added, but I would be lying if I let you believe my mother's silence was the only one kept in this room these 3 months. I knew nothing of your inheritance. I did know, from the first fortnight of our acquaintance, that your stepmother spoke of you the way a woman speaks of an asset rather than a daughter, and I said nothing of it to you, because I told myself it was not my place to interfere in a household before I had any right to. I watched you arrive at 3 separate dinners in gowns clearly cut down from someone else's, and I complimented the workmanship instead of asking why, because I did not wish to embarrass you in front of others. I have only just realized, standing in this vestry, that what I actually did was leave you alone in it. I am not proud of the distinction, and I should have made it sooner. It was, Cordelia thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in that church all morning, including her own dead mother's letter, because it cost him something to say it, in front of his own mother and the woman who had wronged her, and he said it anyway. Why did you offer for me at all? She asked, if not for a fortune you didn't know about, and not for connections I plainly didn't have. The Duke was quiet a moment, not the practiced stillness she had grown used to, but something closer to a man choosing his words because they mattered, rather than because they were safe. Because you were the only woman in London who never once asked me for anything, he said, and I have spent 11 years since my father died being asked for something by nearly everyone who ever smiled at me. My title, my money, my influence at court, my silence about their own debts. You asked me for none of it. You barely asked me to sit beside you at supper. I told myself it was restraint on your part. I have only just understood, hearing my own mother speak of a dying woman's last promise for her daughter, that it was never restraint at all. You had simply been taught your whole life not to expect anything from anyone, ever, and I mistook the wound for a virtue and courted you for it, without once asking myself what it had cost you to acquire. Cordelia felt something in her chest give way that had been braced for years. That is not a flattering thing to admit, she said, and her voice was not quite steady. No, he agreed. It is the truth, though, and you have had a great deal of everything else said to you today except that. The vestry was very quiet. Priscilla stood apart from all of it now, diminished in a way 300 whispering guests could never have accomplished on their own, and the Chancery solicitor cleared his throat with the particular discomfort of a man who has wandered into a family's grief and has nowhere left to stand. It was Cordelia, in the end, who broke the silence. "I should like to be married today," she said, "but not in a stolen morning gown, and not as a version of myself either of you decided on, without asking me first." She looked at the dowager. "You said the trust is mine regardless of marriage. Then I am not marrying to be saved from her." A glance at Priscilla, cool now rather than wounded. "And I am not marrying you," to the Duke, "because you feel you owe me an apology for 3 months of comfortable silence. I should like to be asked again, properly, knowing everything you know now, with nothing left unsaid between us." Something that was almost a smile moved across the Duke of Ravensmere's face. Rare enough, those who knew him well would have said, to be worth remarking on for a decade. "Then give me an hour," he said, "and I will ask you properly, in a dress that belongs to you, in front of every one of those 300 people, currently wondering why the doors have been shut this long." He did not explain how. He simply left the vestry, and the Dowager Duchess, watching her son go, allowed herself the smallest, most satisfied sound Cordelia had heard from anyone all morning. What happened in that hour would be spoken of in London drawing rooms for a full season afterward, though never with any real agreement as to how it had been managed. The Duke's own modiste, it emerged, kept a bridal gown of ivory silk finished for a client whose engagement had broken not a fortnight prior, and 3 seamstresses were paid a sum that made the girl who delivered the gown to St. George's flush to repeat it aloud. Cordelia never asked how he had known her measurements closely enough for it to fit as though made for her alone, and he never volunteered the answer, though the Dowager, years later, would let slip that he had quietly obtained them from Cordelia's own dressmaker weeks before the wedding. "In case," he had said at the time, without explaining in case of what. A small, private contingency built long before he had any notion he would need it, which told Cordelia, when she finally heard the story, more about the quality of his care than any speech could have. She walked the aisle a second time that day in a gown that was entirely her own, bought by no one's cruelty and owed to no one's guilt, and if the 300 guests who had watched her walk it the first time in blue found the reversal remarkable, none of them said so above a whisper, because the look on the Duke of Ravensmere's face when the doors opened again silenced whatever they might have thought to say. Priscilla Wren was not present for the second ceremony. She had been quietly, firmly escorted to a waiting carriage by the Dowager's own steward, with the promise, delivered without heat, which made it land harder than any threat could have, that Chancery's appointed trustees would be calling upon her within the week regarding the management of a trust she had never had any legal right to touch, and that whatever she had spent of Cordelia's inheritance across 8 years of guardianship would be accounted for, to the last shilling, before the court. She was not ruined outright. Cordelia, when asked afterward whether she wished to see her stepmother prosecuted to the fullest the law allowed, said only that she wanted an accounting, not a spectacle, that the woman who had raised her, however imperfectly, had at least never once told her to her face that she was worthless, only shown it in 100 smaller ways. Cordelia no longer had any interest in relitigating in a courtroom. It was not forgiveness. She was careful, in her own mind, never to call it that. It was simply the decision to stop carrying a debt that had never truly been hers to pay. She married Julian Marchmont, Duke of Ravensmere, at 12:30 on a bright autumn afternoon in the year 1817, in a gown that belonged to no one's scheme but her own choosing, and when he lifted her veil at last before the altar, he did not say anything grand or rehearsed. He only looked at her the way he had looked at her in the vestry, when he had finally understood what his own silence had cost her, and said, quietly, so that only she could hear it, properly asked and properly answered, "I will spend a good deal longer than an hour making up for the parts I got wrong." "See that you do," she said, and for the first time that whole long, strange morning, she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not allowed herself in years of learning that wanting things allowed only invited them to be taken away. They did not live, in the years that followed, without disagreement or difficulty. No marriage built on so much unspoken history could have managed that. But the Duke never again mistook silence for kindness, and made a habit, in the early years of their marriage, of asking rather than assuming whenever he sensed her going quiet in a way that once would have passed unremarked. And Cordelia never again believed that the things worth having were the things no one would notice if she surrendered them. Her mother's fortune she kept largely untouched, in her own name, in her own account, a fact the Duke insisted upon publicly and often, to the considerable irritation of anyone who had ever assumed a married woman's money quietly became her husband's the moment the ring was fitted. And on the mantel of her private sitting room at Ravensmere House, framed rather than locked away, she kept her mother's letter, not as a wound to revisit, but as the one inheritance no one had ever managed to sell out from under her. What do you think? Did Priscilla deserve a harsher reckoning than she got, or was Cordelia right to choose an accounting over a spectacle? Tell me in the comments, and if this one kept you watching until the end, you already know what to do before the next story begins.